1 year had passed since the moderate success of Parasite Eve, and to most of us it was clear that Squaresoft wouldn't just leave this new and interesting property to rot in the company vault. So all that was required was a return to Ayabrea's world with all of its unique, genre-bending gameplay intact. And Squaresoft isn't staffed by a bunch of idiots, so that's exactly what they did not do. Taking place some years after the world's brush with a genetic apocalypse in New York, Parasite Eve 2 sees Ayabrea working a new beat. It seems that her skills in combating Eve's creations didn't go unnoticed, and when the FBI took an interest in hunting these monsters down, Aya was an obvious pick. Now, working with the Mitochondria Investigation and Suppression Team, MIST for short, Aya serves as some kind of superhuman bounty hunter. The game starts off with Aya responding to an outbreak of these NMCs at the Acropolis Tower in LA. After a bit of detective work, we find that these neo-mitochondria creatures can disguise themselves as humans. And if that's not enough to worry about, there's a masked psycho on the loose known only as Number 9. Not only does this guy pose more questions than he answers, but he also has apparently rigged the building to blow. After a not very epic rooftop fight, the building explodes and Aya is assigned to investigate some possible monster action in the Mojave Desert. Specifically, a little roadside town called Dryfield. As you might imagine, things aren't exactly what they seem, and it isn't too long till Aya is uncovering a secret plot to forcefully evolve mankind by some kind of mysterious group. As a sequel to one of my favorite RPGs of all time, I have to say that PE2 does a good job of nailing that Parasite Eve feeling. The sci-fi themes are present and accounted for, but this time with a pinch of government conspiracy and an increased emphasis on having the game's mysteries slowly unveil themselves to the player. Sure, they may have taken a couple of liberties with the established character traits of our beloved Ayabrea, but there really isn't anything here that doesn't feel like the kind of change in perspective that comes from single-handedly pulling the world back from the brink of extinction. Overall, I'd say this story is a pretty faithful follow-up that does the brand justice. Sure, the setting and specifics may have changed, but this really feels like a Parasite Eve story. And I wish I could say the same thing for the gameplay. As you might remember, Parasite Eve was made up of 2 equal parts, half survival horror, half RPG. Right from the start, it's easy to see that Part 2 leans much further to one side of that spectrum than the other. Ditching the top-down RPG-style controls we're used to, Squaresoft opted to go with tank controls and quasi-traditional survival horror combat in this outing. And while I can applaud them for trying something different, it's hard not to feel like this was done more as a cash-in than a genuine creative decision. But that being said, most games nowadays can be traced back to obvious trends in design anyways. So did Square at least pull this one off? Well, not really. Listen, I've always been a vocal supporter of tank controls, so I'm not going to rail PE2 for making a switch. But one element of design that these controls need to be paired with is an environment that facilitates them. Oftentimes, PE2 will have you fighting in very cramped quarters with enemies that can close the gap in record time. Hell, sometimes you'll be stuck in one end of a narrow hallway with a projectile shooting asshole on the other. But bad controls and environments aren't the only issue here. Most of the time, the game's lock-on system will pose a much larger threat than any enemy you're going to fight. The general idea is hitting square will put you into fire mode and lock onto the nearest monster. Now this makes sense in theory since these NMCs are a lot more agile than any resident of Raccoon City, but in practice the system is borderline broken. Once you've locked onto an enemy, I will turn to face that direction after every move, and this makes evasion insanely hard since I will turn back towards the target as soon as you stop pressing a direction. This means that simply turning isn't an option. Aya has to be moving forward before any left or right turns can be made. It's kinda hard to explain, but trust me, this lock-on system makes the late game way more of a chore than it has any right being. On the upside though, you are given more options in combat than any self-respecting survival horror game. On top of shooting and evading, you can also access your mitochondria abilities, and you would assume casting fireballs and attack increasing buffs would feel out of place given the survival horror playstyle, but magic fits in pretty well here. Sometimes enemies will require certain elemental attacks to take down, and bigger groups of small enemies can often be taken out by a well-placed area of effect attack. At the end of every fight, you're given EXP to level up these abilities, and since Aya is essentially a bounty hunter, bounty points to trade in for new armor, ammo, and guns. Now, I know what you're thinking, and no, sadly the weapon customization that made the original such a joy has not made it into this entry. In place of gun mods, PE2 lets you add accessories to some weapons, like flashlights, tasers, and bayonets. Now, I get the idea that they thought they were following in the spirit of the first game with these purchasable add-ons, but honestly, they are no replacement for the deep customization you're undoubtedly going to be looking for. Other than this, Parasite Eve 2 is a pretty by-the-book survival horror game. You're going to spend all of your non-combat time navigating really well-made pre-rendered backgrounds, backtracking through previous areas, and solving puzzles. And anyone who knows me knew I wasn't just going to gloss over those backgrounds. Yes, people, I'm going to say it, this game looks fucking awesome, especially for its time. Squaresoft has always been known for having some of the best CG cutscenes on the PS1, so it makes sense that their pre-rendered environments are more than a couple of cuts above the competition. And even though the first game was less than 2 years old at this point, it's clear that some big strides were made in Squaresoft in regards to 3D modeling. Compared to the first game, this is a giant leap in progress, and little additions like characters being lit by particle effects and muzzle flashes shows the Square put a good deal more money into this project than the first game. And speaking of money, that leads us to the million-dollar question here. Is this a worthy successor to what was an incredible RPG? Well, no, not really. From a gameplay perspective, it's pretty clear that Square was emulating a popular style, but lacked the know-how to implement it correctly. The fact that real-time survival horror combat was just a bit outside of their wheelhouse is pretty obvious right out of the gate. As far as the decision to go full survival horror goes, well, I kinda liked it. Maybe it's the fanboy in me, but unlike most people who will criticize this game, I actually like the direction they took. Sure, they didn't pull it off very well, but the potential is definitely here. Maybe because of this, I still look back on it pretty fondly. But it's a kind of fondness you can only get from an interesting but ultimately failed experiment. Much like the first game, Parasite Eve 2 was a polarizing clash of two wildly different worlds, and in that sense, I think it follows a little closer to the original than people are likely to admit. As for my personal experience with it, well, this was one of the first games I ever bought with my own money, and because of that, I'll probably always have a warm place for it in my brain's nostalgia center. So, should fans of the first game play it? Well, probably not, but I would like to recommend it to fans of survival horror. Sure, it's clunky as all hell and lacks any and all balance, but it's a cool look at a fresh approach to the genre. Now, obviously it can't hold a candle to the original game, but it still has its place as a gaming oddity. And if you're gonna play it, it should be approached with some tempered expectations. Well guys, that's 2/3 of this series in the books. Now make sure to stick around because next week we'll be taking a look at the third and final game in the series to answer the age-old question. Can you even make a Parasite Eve game without using the title Parasite Eve? But until then, I'm Jared, and this is Avalanche Reviews. Hey guys, thanks for hanging out. If you like this, you can check out the other episodes in the retrospective by clicking right here. And if you want to see more, let me know by hitting that like button, and maybe possibly think about checking out my Patreon page to support more videos just like this one.